Police officer cuts black woman's passport. Her identity as a UN ambassador shocks entire airport. What if a single moment of arrogance revealed the depths of systemic injustice? This story takes you inside an event that begins in an airport, where a black woman's quiet dignity clashes with a police officer's reckless abuse of power. But here's the twist. This isn't just about humiliation. By the end, you'll see how one act of prejudice unraveled, leaving everyone stunned and a nation talking. This is an inspiring story of resilience and justice. Alara Vance adjusted the strap of her elegant leather bag on her shoulder as she approached the customs line. Her tailored navy blue blazer, worn over a white blouse, gave her a polished yet approachable look, one befitting her role as a United Nations ambassador. It had been a grueling 2-week diplomatic mission overseas, and the thought of finally returning home to New York filled her with relief. The airport buzzed with the usual mix of travelers, some frazzled, others cheerful, a few with sleepy eyes fixed on their phones. Alara noted the diversity of faces in the crowd and allowed herself a small smile. She had spent her career advocating for equality and understanding, and this was a subtle reminder of the beautiful tapestry humanity wove. But her serene mood was shattered when she reached the customs counter. "Next," barked the officer, snapping her from her thoughts. Alara stepped forward and handed her passport to the man behind the counter. His badge read Officer Coleman, and his pale blue eyes were sharp with suspicion. His demeanor immediately set her on edge. He didn't greet her as he had the passenger before her, a white man who received a pleasant, almost jovial welcome. Instead, Coleman took her passport and began flipping through it with an exaggerated intensity, as if expecting to find something wrong. "Where are you coming from?" he asked, his tone curt, almost accusatory. "Geneva," Alara replied calmly. Her voice carried the poise of someone accustomed to scrutiny, but she couldn't ignore the way his gaze lingered on her, searching for a flaw. "Purpose of travel? Diplomatic mission," she said, gesturing toward the small insignia on her blazer, the emblem of the United Nations. She had been part of a summit on global education reform, a topic she was deeply passionate about. But Coleman barely glanced at the insignia before returning his attention to her passport. The seconds stretched into an uncomfortable silence as he examined the document, turning the pages back and forth unnecessarily. The faint creak of his chair and the tap of his pen against the desk were the only sounds. Alara could feel the growing impatience of the travelers behind her, their murmurs barely audible but distinctly judgmental. Finally, Coleman looked up, his lips pressed into a thin line. "This passport doesn't look right." Alara raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me. This doesn't add up," he said, holding the passport up as if to show the non-existent flaws to the growing line of passengers. "The stamps, the paper quality, something's off here." The accusation hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Around her, heads turned, whispers rippled through the crowd. Alara's heart tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. Years of diplomatic training had taught her how to maintain her composure under pressure. "Officer, I assure you my passport is valid," she said evenly. "If there's an issue, I'd be happy to provide additional documentation." But Coleman didn't seem interested in resolving the matter. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, and smirked. "You expect me to believe this is legitimate? I've seen better fakes." Alara's fingers tightened around the handle of her bag. She took a slow, calming breath before replying. "I'm not sure what you're implying, but I've traveled with this passport countless times without issue." Her calm response seemed to agitate him further. "Step aside," he ordered. "We'll need to investigate this further." "I don't believe that's necessary," she began, but her words were cut off by his next action. With a sudden, dramatic motion, Coleman reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a pair of scissors. The crowd gasped audibly as he held her passport aloft. "If this is fake," he declared loudly, "it doesn't belong in circulation." "Wait." Alara's voice was firm, but it was too late. With 2 swift cuts, he sliced the passport cleanly in half. The halves fluttered to the desk like fallen leaves. Alara stared at the remnants, her heart pounding. Around her, the murmurs grew louder, some supportive, others skeptical. "You can't do that," Alara said, her voice rising for the first time. Her calm exterior cracked ever so slightly, and the disbelief in her tone was impossible to hide. "That passport is a legal document." Coleman shrugged, his expression smug. "Not anymore." The weight of the moment pressed down on her as the crowd's attention bore into her like 1,000 needles. Alara stood frozen for a moment, grappling with the enormity of what had just happened. Her identity, her access, her ability to navigate the world as a diplomat had all been violated in a matter of seconds. But as she looked into Coleman's smug, self-satisfied face, something inside her hardened. She straightened her back and adjusted her blazer with deliberate precision. "Officer Coleman," she said quietly, her voice steely with determination, "you've just made a grave mistake." His smirk widened. "Is that a threat?" "No," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "It's a promise." Coleman's laugh was a sharp bark, devoid of humor. "We'll see about that." As she was escorted to a holding room, Alara clutched her bag tightly, her mind racing. She knew the power she held and the resources at her disposal. Coleman didn't know it yet, but his actions had set into motion consequences he could never have imagined. And as Alara stepped into the stark, fluorescent-lit room, she allowed herself one small, knowing smile. Alara sat in the cold, stark room, the fluorescent lights overhead casting a harsh glare on the dull gray walls. A metal chair and a small table were the only furnishings. It felt more like an interrogation room than a holding area. The echoes of the officer's words, his smug accusations, and the sound of her passport being sliced in half still reverberated in her mind. She placed her bag on the table and folded her hands in front of her, her face a mask of calm. Outwardly, she appeared composed, but her mind was a tempest of emotions, disbelief, anger, and a steady undercurrent of resolve. She had faced challenges far greater than this, but there was something deeply personal about this moment. It wasn't just her credentials that had been attacked. It was her dignity, her identity. The door creaked open, and a young woman in a crisp security uniform entered. Her name tag read Officer Nash. Her steps faltered when she saw Alara sitting so poised, her presence commanding despite the indignity of the situation. "Ms. Vance," Officer Nash began cautiously, "I've been asked to keep you here until further notice. Officer Coleman is preparing a formal report." Alara met the woman's gaze, her own steady and calm. "And what exactly is the charge?" Officer Nash hesitated. "He believes your passport is fraudulent." Alara leaned back slightly in her chair, studying the woman. She noted the faint tremor in Nash's hands and the slight downward tilt of her eyes. She was uncomfortable, perhaps even questioning the situation, but protocol likely left her little room to act otherwise. "My passport was issued directly by the United States government and bears a diplomatic seal," Alara said, her tone firm but not confrontational. "Destroying it is a violation of international law." Officer Nash's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to respond but thought better of it. "I'll let them know you said that," she murmured before leaving the room. The door clicked shut, leaving Alara alone again. She exhaled slowly, allowing herself a moment to think. Her training had taught her that in moments of crisis, it was vital to stay composed. She reached into her bag and retrieved her phone. It wasn't about anger or retribution. It was about accountability. She scrolled through her contacts, her fingers pausing briefly before selecting a name: Director Avery. He was her immediate superior at the United Nations, a man she knew would understand the gravity of the situation. The phone rang twice before his voice came through, deep and steady. "Alara, is everything all right?" "Not exactly," she replied, keeping her voice even. "I'm at the airport, and there's been an incident." Avery was silent for a moment, then asked, "What kind of incident?" Alara explained succinctly, detailing the accusations, the destruction of her passport, and her current predicament. She could hear the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "They cut your passport?" he repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. "Yes," she said, in front of a crowd. "I've been detained since." Avery's tone shifted, firm and commanding. "Stay where you are. I'll handle this." "I appreciate that," Alara replied, "but I'd like this addressed not just for myself, but for what it represents. This kind of behavior shouldn't happen to anyone." "You're absolutely right," Avery said. "I'll escalate this immediately. Expect a call shortly." Alara ended the call and placed her phone back into her bag. There was no need for further action on her part. She had planted the seed, and now it was only a matter of time. Still, she couldn't help but reflect on the events that had unfolded. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of raised voices outside the door. She recognized one of them as Officer Coleman's, his tone sharp and defensive. "I don't care who she says she is," he barked. "A fake is a fake." Another voice, calmer but insistent, responded, "You've overstepped, Coleman." If she's who they say she is, you've made a serious mistake. Alara's lips twitched into a faint smile. The wheels were already turning. The door opened abruptly, and Coleman strode in, his expression a mixture of arrogance and irritation. Behind him was a man in a suit, clearly a senior official, and Officer Nash, who now looked even more uneasy. "Well, Ms. Vance," Coleman began, his tone dripping with condescension, "it seems you've been making quite a fuss." Alara regarded him coolly. "The only fuss here is your blatant abuse of authority." The senior official stepped forward, cutting off Coleman before he could respond. "Ms. Vance, my name is William Harding. I'm the head of airport security. I'd like to apologize for the inconvenience you faced." Alara tilted her head slightly. "An inconvenience is a delayed flight, Mr. Harding. This was a deliberate act of humiliation." Harding nodded, his face pale. "You're absolutely right, and we're investigating the matter thoroughly. However, I've just received confirmation from the State Department regarding your credentials." Coleman stiffened, his eyes darting between Harding and Alara. "State Department?" he repeated, his voice cracking slightly. "Yes," Harding said firmly. "Ms. Vance is a UN ambassador with full diplomatic immunity. Destroying her passport was not only a grave error, but a breach of international protocol." Coleman's face turned ashen, but he quickly recovered, attempting to defend himself. "She could have been lying. It's my job to protect." "Enough!" Harding's voice echoed through the room, silencing Coleman. "Your actions were reckless and unacceptable. There will be consequences." Alara rose from her seat, her movements deliberate. "I appreciate your acknowledgement, Mr. Harding. However, I believe this matter requires more than internal consequences." Coleman opened his mouth to retort, but the look on Harding's face stopped him. Alara picked up her bag, her posture as composed as ever. "Now," she said, her voice sharp with authority, "I'd like to be on my way, and I expect a full report of this incident sent to my office." As she walked past Coleman, she paused for a moment, meeting his panicked gaze. "Ignorance is not an excuse," she said quietly before stepping out into the corridor. Alara walked through the long corridor of the airport, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. The air felt heavy, not just with the tension lingering from the confrontation, but with the weight of what she knew was coming. She had been in situations where power dynamics shifted unexpectedly, but this one had a personal sting. It wasn't just about her passport. It was about standing up against the casual misuse of authority and the prejudice embedded within it. As she approached the main terminal, she noticed the crowd that had gathered. Some of the passengers who had witnessed the incident were still there, their faces etched with curiosity and concern. Whispers rippled through the group as they saw her emerge, her composure intact. Alara held her head high, offering a polite nod to those who met her gaze. She wasn't here to cause a spectacle, but she understood the importance of maintaining her dignity in moments like these. She glanced over her shoulder and saw Officer Coleman trailing behind her, his face pale, but his jaw set in defiance. William Harding, the head of airport security, walked alongside him, his phone pressed to his ear. The atmosphere shifted when Alara's phone buzzed in her bag. She paused, pulling it out with practiced grace. The name flashing on the screen made her eyebrows lift slightly in acknowledgement. It was Director Avery. She answered swiftly. "Ambassador Vance." Avery's voice came through, calm, but with an edge of authority. "I've spoken with the State Department and the UN Secretary General's office. They are fully briefed on your situation. I trust the airport has begun addressing the matter." "They have," Alara replied, her voice steady but low, though the responsible party seems reluctant to grasp the gravity of what he's done. "That won't last long," Avery assured her. "We've escalated this further. A senior representative from Homeland Security is on their way to the airport as we speak. This won't go unnoticed." Alara allowed herself a small sigh of relief. "Thank you, Director. I'll ensure the matter is handled properly here." After ending the call, she turned to Harding, who had just concluded his own conversation. His expression was grim, a man caught between appeasing someone of immense importance and managing the fallout from one of his employees. "Ms. Vance," Harding began cautiously, "I've been informed that additional federal officials will be arriving shortly to oversee this matter. I assure you, everything that happened today will be thoroughly investigated." Alara nodded, but didn't let him off the hook so easily. "I expect more than just an investigation, Mr. Harding. Officer Coleman's actions were not merely procedural errors. They were fueled by prejudice. This isn't just a breach of protocol. It's an abuse of power that cannot be swept under the rug. Coleman, who had been standing off to the side, visibly flinched at her words. He stepped forward, his voice tight with defensiveness. I was doing my job, protecting this country from fraud and security risks. Alara turned to face him fully, her sharp gaze cutting through his bravado. Your job, she said slowly, each word deliberate, is to ensure the safety and integrity of this country's borders, not to humiliate or degrade individuals based on unfounded assumptions. Cutting my passport wasn't just reckless, it was unlawful. Coleman's face flushed, his fists clenching at his sides, but he said nothing. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, some shaking their heads in disapproval, others taking out their phones to record the unfolding scene. Just then, the sound of brisk footsteps echoed through the terminal. Two men in dark suits approached, their demeanor authoritative. The Homeland Security insignia pinned to their lapels left no doubt as to who they were. One of them, a tall man with salt and pepper hair, stepped forward and addressed the group. Ambassador Vance, he said, inclining his head respectfully. I'm Special Agent Foster with Homeland Security. I've been briefed on the situation, and I'm here to ensure this matter is resolved appropriately. Alara offered a polite nod. Thank you for coming, Agent Foster. I trust you understand the severity of what has occurred. We do, Foster replied, his tone professional. Officer Coleman's actions were entirely inappropriate and a violation of both federal and international laws. He will be placed on administrative leave pending further investigation. Coleman's face went pale, and his mouth opened as if to protest, but no words came out. Foster didn't give him the chance. Furthermore, Foster continued, turning to Harding, the Department of Homeland Security will be conducting a full review of your airport's procedures and training programs to ensure this kind of incident does not happen again. Harding nodded quickly, beads of sweat forming on his brow. Of course, Agent Foster. We'll cooperate fully. Alara watched the exchange with a measured expression, though inwardly, she felt a flicker of satisfaction. Justice was unfolding before her eyes, but there was still work to be done. Agent Foster, she said, her voice carrying a note of authority, I appreciate your swift response, but I'd like to ensure this incident becomes a teaching moment for others. Racism and abuse of power have no place in any institution, especially not in those tasked with protecting the public. Foster nodded solemnly. We'll make sure this incident is addressed comprehensively, Ambassador Vance. Alara inclined her head, her expression softening slightly. Thank you. As Coleman was escorted away, his once arrogant posture replaced by a defeated slump, the crowd began to disperse, some clapping quietly as Alara walked past. She didn't acknowledge the applause but kept her focus forward, her steps steady and purposeful. When she finally reached the exit, the crisp air outside felt like a balm against the tension that had been building inside her. She paused for a moment, taking a deep breath, then pulled out her phone. There was one more call she needed to make, to her team at the UN. This wasn't just about her. It was about creating systemic change. As she walked toward her car, her resolve hardened. This was only the beginning. The black sedan pulled smoothly up to the curb outside the airport. Alara climbed into the back seat, setting her bag carefully beside her. The driver, a middle-aged man with a warm but professional demeanor, glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Welcome back, Ambassador Vance, he said. Are you heading straight to the office? No, David, Alara replied, her voice calm but firm. Take me home. It's been an eventful day. David didn't ask further, sensing the gravity in her tone. The car pulled away from the curb, leaving the airport's chaotic energy behind. Alara stared out the window, her mind replaying the events of the morning. The cutting sound of the scissors still echoed in her thoughts. Each snip had felt like a symbolic assault, a reminder of the biases she fought against every day. But she also recognized the power of what had just occurred. This wasn't merely a personal affront, it was a public reckoning. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. The screen displayed the name of her chief of staff, Amelia Walsh. Alara answered swiftly. Amelia, she greeted. I was just about to call you. I heard what happened, Amelia said, her voice tinged with both concern and outrage. The news is already spreading. Someone in the airport recorded the entire incident. It's all over social media. Alara's brow furrowed. Social media? Yes, Amelia confirmed. A passenger uploaded the video. It shows the officer cutting your passport and everything that followed. The comments are pouring in. People are furious. Alara sighed, leaning back in her seat. She wasn't one for public spectacles, but she understood the importance of visibility in moments like this. How bad is the backlash? It's significant, Amelia replied. Several civil rights organizations have already issued statements condemning the officer's actions. And it's not just the public. Officials at the State Department and the UN are weighing in. This could become a much larger conversation. Alara considered this. Let's make sure it does, she said firmly. Prepare a press statement for tomorrow. I want the focus to be on accountability and reform, not just my experience, but the systemic issues that allow this kind of behavior to persist. Understood, Amelia said. And Alara, I'm so sorry you had to go through that. Alara's lips pressed into a thin line. Thank you, Amelia. But this isn't just about me. It's about making sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. After ending the call, Alara returned her gaze to the window. The cityscape was familiar, yet today it felt different. The weight of her role, of her identity, pressed more heavily than usual. She had chosen this path because she believed in the power of diplomacy and dialogue. But moments like these reminded her that change often required more than words. It required action. Alara sat at her dining table, a steaming cup of herbal tea in her hands. The soft light of the setting sun filtered through the large windows, casting a warm glow over the room. Her laptop sat open before her, its screen displaying the video Amelia had mentioned. With some hesitation, she pressed play. The footage was shaky, but the content was clear. It showed her handing over her passport, Officer Coleman's exaggerated scrutiny, and the dramatic moment he cut it in half. The camera captured the gasps of the crowd and her calm but firm response. The video ended with the arrival of the Homeland Security agents and Coleman being led away. Alara paused the video, staring at the frozen frame of her own face. The calmness she saw there was deceptive. It masked the storm of emotions she had felt in that moment, but it also reminded her of her strength. She had faced this not as a victim, but as a fighter, someone who refused to be diminished. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a notification. She opened it to find an email from the UN Secretary-General's office. The message was brief but supportive, assuring her that the organization stood firmly behind her. There was also a request for her to address the incident at an upcoming press conference. Alara leaned back in her chair, sipping her tea as she considered her next steps. The press conference would be an opportunity to amplify the conversation, to push for broader changes. But it would also be a delicate balancing act. She needed to channel the public's outrage into productive action without letting the narrative become overly sensationalized. The conference room at the United Nations headquarters was abuzz with activity. Reporters filled the rows of chairs, their cameras and microphones ready. Alara stood just off stage, reviewing her notes one final time. She wore a deep burgundy suit, a color that projected confidence and authority. Amelia approached her, expression a mix of encouragement and professionalism. "You're ready," she said simply. Alara nodded. "Let's do this." As she stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. The cameras flashed, but she ignored them, focusing instead on the faces of those before her. Taking her place at the podium, she adjusted the microphone and began to speak. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Yesterday, I experienced an incident that was deeply troubling, not only as a diplomat, but as a human being. It was an incident rooted in prejudice, ignorance, and an abuse of power." The room hung on her every word. "What happened to me is not unique. It is a reflection of the systemic biases that countless individuals face every day. As a UN ambassador, I have dedicated my career to fostering equality and understanding, but yesterday I was reminded of how much work remains to be done." Alara paused, letting the weight of her words settle. This is not just about one officer or one incident. It is about creating systems of accountability, ensuring that those in positions of power use that power responsibly, and addressing the deeper issues that allow such behavior to persist. She spoke for another 10 minutes, outlining the steps she believed were necessary to prevent similar incidents. Her words were measured but impassioned, striking a balance between personal experience and universal principles. When she finished, the room erupted into applause. Reporters called out questions, but she only answered a few, focusing on the broader message rather than the personal details. As she stepped off the stage, Amelia was waiting for her, a look of pride on her face. "You were incredible," she said. Alara gave a small smile. "This is just the beginning." And she meant it. The conference left a ripple of energy in its wake. As Alara returned to her office that afternoon, the weight of her words and the resonance they carried was beginning to settle. Emails poured in, messages of support from colleagues, civil rights organizations, and even a few individuals who shared their own stories of injustice. Alara responded to as many as she could, her replies thoughtful and personal. She understood that while her voice had power, it was the collective momentum of these voices that could truly spark change. She sat at her desk, her office bathed in warm afternoon light. The walls were lined with bookshelves, each shelf a testament to years of dedication to diplomacy and human rights. A photo of her parents rested on her desk, a reminder of the sacrifices and resilience that shaped her journey. Her father's quiet strength and her mother's unwavering belief in justice had been her anchors. The soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she called, setting down her pen. Amelia stepped in, carrying a thin file in her hands. Her expression was serious but composed. "Alara, I thought you'd want to see this." "What is it?" Alara asked, gesturing for Amelia to take a seat. "It's an initial report from Homeland Security about Officer Coleman," Amelia replied, handing over the file. "They expedited the investigation, given the attention this case is getting." Alara opened the file and scanned the content. It was a detailed account of Coleman's actions, not just during her encounter, but in previous incidents. It outlined a troubling pattern, a history of complaints filed by travelers of color, allegations of excessive scrutiny, and in some cases, outright hostility. Her jaw tightened as she read. The report painted a picture of a man who had abused his position for years, shielded by a system that had overlooked or dismissed complaints. "How did he stay in this role for so long?" she asked, her voice low but edged with frustration. Amelia sighed. According to the report, most of the complaints were investigated but ultimately dismissed. Either there wasn't enough evidence, or they deemed the accusations inconclusive. Alara closed the file and leaned back in her chair. "This isn't just about Coleman," she said after a moment. "This is about the system that allowed him to operate unchecked." Amelia nodded. "What do you want to do?" Alara didn't hesitate. "I want a meeting with the airport's senior leadership, and I want representatives from Homeland Security, the State Department, and the UN present. This has to go beyond apologies. We need actionable reform." "I'll set it up," Amelia said, her voice resolute. Months passed, and the seeds Alara had planted began to bear fruit. The legislation she had championed, the Accountability in Airport Practices Act, gained traction, supported by civil rights organizations, lawmakers, and citizens who had grown tired of enduring systemic injustice. Her tireless advocacy had sparked a nationwide conversation, and now change was finally within reach. The airport where the incident had occurred became the first to implement the proposed reforms. Anti-bias training sessions were mandatory for all staff, independent oversight committees were established, and complaints were publicly tracked to ensure accountability. The airport's leadership, once resistant, issued a heartfelt apology and a public commitment to rebuilding trust with travelers. Alara's actions didn't just change policies, they inspired people. Robert Davis, the man whose story had gone viral, became a key figure in the campaign, traveling alongside Alara to share his experiences. Together, they reminded people that their voices mattered, that silence only served the oppressors. On a crisp morning 6 months after the incident, Alara stood at the same airport, this time preparing for another diplomatic mission. As she approached the security checkpoint, she noticed an officer who seemed vaguely familiar. It was Officer Nash, the young woman who had escorted her to the holding room during that fateful day. Nash looked up, recognition flickering in her eyes. Her posture was more confident now, and there was a hint of gratitude in her smile. "Ambassador Vance," she said, her tone respectful but warm. "It's an honor to see you again." Alara smiled gently. "It's good to see you too, Officer Nash." "I wanted to thank you," Nash said quietly. "After that day, I started to reflect on my own role. I've since completed training programs, and I've committed to being part of the solution. You changed more than you know." Alara placed a hand on Nash's arm briefly. "Thank you for telling me. Change begins when we're willing to look inward." As Alara moved through the checkpoint and onto her flight, she couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. The scars of that day remained, but they had been transformed into something powerful, a catalyst for progress. Months turned into years, and the ripples of Alara's actions continued to spread. Airports across the country adopted reforms modeled after her efforts. and the legislation she had championed became law. Stories of abuse, once buried, were now brought to light, and those responsible were held accountable. Alara herself remained at the forefront of the fight for justice, her role as a diplomat evolving to encompass the broader mission of equality. She often reflected on the moment Officer Coleman had cut her passport, realizing now that it had been more than an act of destruction. It had been the spark for a transformative journey. On a rainy evening in New York, Alara sat in her study, surrounded by letters, awards, and mementos of her work. One letter stood out, a handwritten note from Robert Davis. Alara, because of you, my daughter now believes she can walk through any door and be treated with the respect she deserves. Thank you for reminding us all that change is possible. Alara folded the letter carefully and set it on her desk, her heart full. She knew the fight wasn't over, it never truly was. But she also knew she had made a difference. As the rain tapped softly against the windows, Alara looked out into the night. She felt a deep sense of purpose, knowing that justice, though often delayed, could never be denied when people stood together. And with that thought, she smiled, a quiet, resolute smile that carried the weight of every voice she had amplified and every life she had touched. The journey continued, but for now, there was peace. And so, what began as an act of prejudice became a powerful turning point, not just for one woman, but for countless others who finally saw justice take flight. This story reminds us that resilience and courage can challenge even the deepest injustices. If you found this story inspiring, remember that sharing powerful narratives helps spark change and empower voices. Together, we can keep these conversations alive.